Listen to me carefully, because what happened to me sounds like something people would only believe in a movie. The day my husband was buried, his children looked me in the eye and told me I was nothing but a gold digger, not a wife, not a grieving woman, not even a human being in their eyes. Just a problem. And then, less than 48 hours after his funeral, they served me with a lawsuit. They wanted my home, my savings, my jewelry, my future, everything. They thought I was weak. They thought I was alone. They thought grief had already broken me. So I did something that made them smile. I agreed to sign everything over. And that was the moment they believed they had won. But by the time their lawyer finished reading the fine print, the smile on their faces was gone. Because what they had just inherited was not wealth. It was ruin. It was debt. It was lawsuits. It was hidden criminal liability. It was years of lies buried inside the very empire their father built. And while they were celebrating my surrender, I was walking away clean. Completely clean. My name is Claire. And if you had met me 5 years ago, you would have seen a quiet woman who did not ask for much. I was the kind of woman who liked early mornings, black coffee, clean kitchen counters, and a peaceful life. I was not loud. I was not greedy. I was not the kind of woman who chased rich men. I had built my life slowly, honestly, one hard year at a time. And then I met Daniel Harrington. Now, if that last name means nothing to you, let me explain. In our city, the Harrington name was everywhere. Buildings, donations, hospitals, foundations, country clubs, fundraisers. Daniel Harrington was the kind of man people called self-made when they wanted to sound impressed, and discreet when they wanted to sound respectful. He owned companies. He sat on boards. He made people nervous without raising his voice. He also had 2 adult children from his first marriage, Evan and Victoria. And from the very beginning, they made it clear that I did not belong. When Daniel introduced me, Victoria gave me that perfect smile rich people use when they want to be rude without being obvious. Evan barely shook my hand. The first thing Victoria asked me was, "So what exactly do you do?" Not, "How did you and Dad meet?" Not, "What do you like?" Just that. "What exactly do you do?" As if I had walked into a museum without a ticket. I told her I worked in interior design. I had my own small business. Nothing glamorous. Honest work. Real work. She smiled like she had heard a joke. Evan laughed once and said, "Well, Dad has always had a taste for ambitious women." That was the first time I understood what they thought of me. They did not see a woman. They saw a threat. A woman with no money, no famous family, no power, and no old name must have one reason to marry a man like Daniel. Money. That was the story they told themselves about me. That was the story they repeated in their heads until they believed it. I wanted to fight it at first. I wanted to explain. I wanted to say, "No, you're wrong. I loved your father. I was there when he was sick. I was there when nobody else called. I was there when he could not sleep and had nightmares, and sat in the dark with a glass of water he never drank. But people who are determined to hate you do not listen to your truth. So I learned to stay calm. I learned to keep my voice soft. I learned that dignity is sometimes louder than anger. Daniel and I were married for 9 years. 9 years of dinners, business trips, quiet weekends, and long evenings where he would sit by the window and look like a man carrying something heavy inside him. He was not an easy man. He could be kind, but he could also be distant. He could be charming in public and silent in private. And there were things he never explained. Phone calls that ended when I entered the room. Files that disappeared into a locked office. Visiting attorneys who never looked me in the eye. Financial documents that were always not for me to worry about. At the time, I told myself that was normal for a man like Daniel. Private people have private lives. We all tell ourselves little lies when we love someone enough. But looking back now, I realized the truth had been sitting in front of me the whole time. Daniel was not just hiding stress, he was hiding damage. Massive damage. 3 months before he died, he got sick very suddenly. It was fast. Too fast. The doctors said his heart was weak. Stress had worn him down. He was exhausted from years of carrying too much. In those last months, the house felt different. His children came around more often. Not because they were suddenly loving, not because they wanted to help. They came around like vultures pretending to be relatives. They asked questions. Too many questions. About accounts. About property. About the company. About the trust. Victoria even asked me once very casually, "Did Dad ever tell you what would happen when he's gone?" I remember looking at her and saying, "He said he wanted peace." She smiled and said, "Well, peace is expensive." I still remember how cold that sentence made me feel. Daniel died on a rainy Tuesday. I remember because the rain hit the windows hard that morning, and the whole world outside looked gray and tired, like even the sky was grieving. At the hospital, I held his hand until it went cold. And for all his flaws, for all his secrets, for all the walls between us, I cried like my heart was breaking in half. Because it was. When the funeral came, I wore black. Simple black dress. Simple black shoes. No jewelry except my wedding ring. I stood beside the coffin while people spoke about Daniel as if he were a legend. Visionary, generous, brilliant, a pillar of the community. Nobody said the words I knew were also true. Complicated, secretive, tired, afraid. The children stood at the front like they were already rehearsing for the future. Victoria wore pearls. Evan wore a custom suit. They looked polished, expensive, and very certain that the next chapter of Daniel Harrington's life would belong to them. And I was standing there in the middle of all of it, feeling like a stranger in the life I had helped build. After the service, people came by to hug me. Some were sincere, some were fake, most were uncomfortable. Then I saw the family attorney approaching us. His name was Mark Allison. He had been Daniel's lawyer for years. Tall, thin, hair always too neat, expression always too controlled. He asked if we could speak privately. I thought he wanted to go over the estate process. I did not know that the family had already prepared their trap. We met in a side room at the funeral home. Can you imagine that? Not even one day after burying my husband, and they were already circling the money like sharks. Victoria did not waste time. She sat down and said, "We know exactly what this was." I looked at her. "What are you talking about?" Evan leaned against the wall and folded his arms. "Don't insult us, Claire. You got close to Dad when he was old, sick, and vulnerable. Now you expect to walk away with half of everything." My chest tightened. I said, "I was his wife." Victoria actually laughed. "Wife," she said, like the word tasted bad. "That's convenient." Mark the attorney shifted uncomfortably, but he said nothing. Evan then slid a stack of papers across the table. A lawsuit. They were suing me for fraud, undue influence, and improper access to Daniel's assets. They claimed I manipulated him, that I isolated him, that I pressured him to change his plans, that I was trying to steal what belonged to the family. I remember staring at the papers without blinking. It felt unreal. Not because I was shocked they hated me. I had known that for years. But because they were willing to do this right after the funeral, right after the burial, right after the final prayer, right after the flowers were still fresh. I looked up and said, "You're doing this now?" Victoria crossed her legs and answered, "We're doing this before you get any ideas." Ideas. As if I were some parasite waiting to swallow their family fortune. As if the woman who had sat beside their father through hospital visits and sleepless nights was just a scammer in a black dress. I did not yell. I did not cry. I took the papers into my hands and read them slowly. That silence unsettled them more than any argument could have. Finally, Mark said, "There is another option." All three of us looked at him. He adjusted his glasses and said, Mr. Harrington's estate includes real property, company shares, investment accounts, and several other holdings. If Mrs. Harrington signs a full transfer of her claim to the estate, the family can resolve this quietly. Victoria's eyebrows lifted. Quietly? Mark nodded. Yes. In exchange, Mrs. Harrington would waive any future claim to assets, control, or inheritance. It would end the dispute. Evan looked at me like victory was already his. Victoria folded her hands and said, It's simple. Sign the papers, and we let you leave with what you brought into the marriage. That was the line. Leave with what you brought into the marriage. I actually smiled, not because it was funny, because I had already made my decision. They wanted a war. I was not going to give them one. I set the papers down and said, Fine. Victoria blinked. Fine? I'll sign, I said. Evan frowned. Just like that? I kept my voice even. Just like that. For the first time that day, they looked at each other. I could see the greed moving behind their eyes. They thought I had folded. They thought I was frightened. They thought the lawsuit had crushed me before it even started. Victoria smiled so wide it almost looked painful. Good. Then let's not waste time. Mark did not look relieved. He looked uneasy. Very uneasy. And that should have told them something. But arrogance makes people blind. The next morning, we met at Mark's office. The room was all glass walls and polished wood. The kind of office designed to make people feel small. Evan and Victoria arrived in expensive clothes and expensive confidence. I arrived in the same black dress from the funeral. No jewelry. No makeup beyond a little powder. Hair tied back. I wanted them to remember me, exactly as I was, when they treated me like dirt. Mark placed the papers on the table. Before you sign, he said carefully, I need to clarify the terms one more time. Victoria waved her hand. We understand the terms. Mark ignored her and turned to me. Mrs. Harrington, by signing this agreement, you are transferring your claim to all estate assets, including any interests held through corporate entities controlled by the deceased. Evan smirked. That's why we're here, counselor. Mark continued. And the receiving parties acknowledge acceptance of the estate in full, including assets, obligations, liabilities, pending obligations, and any successor responsibilities as outlined in the estate instruments and corporate operating documents. That sentence should have made them stop. But greed does not like reading carefully. Victoria barely glanced at the pages. Fine, she said. Whatever legal language you need to sleep at night. Mark slid the pen toward me. Mrs. Harrington, are you certain you want to proceed? I looked at him and said, Yes. Not because I was weak, because I had already done my homework. You see, while my husband was alive, I spent years watching things, listening, remembering, saving copies of what I was never supposed to see. There were nights I sat alone after dinner while Daniel worked in his office, and I would hear him on the phone in that low, tense voice he used when he was afraid. I did not know every detail back then, but I knew enough to know that something in his empire was rotten. I knew there were payments that did not make sense. I knew there were companies with names I had never heard of. I knew there were men who came to the house and left looking nervous. I knew Daniel was carrying secrets that could one day explode. And I knew something else too. Men like Daniel never tell the whole truth to the person they love, but they sometimes leave pieces behind. Pieces that can save you. So, months before his death, I started asking quiet questions. Not loudly. Not in a way that would frighten him. I asked one former accountant, one retired tax attorney, one corporate records specialist, a woman from a title office, a man who handled insurance claims. I had no access to the whole machine, but I had enough to understand the shape of the trap. And the trap was simple. Daniel's public wealth was clean on the surface. But behind the surface, there were hidden liabilities. Old loans, unpaid vendor claims, corporate guarantees, tax exposure, litigation settlements. Internal investigations. Potential criminal matters tied to business conduct Daniel had kept buried for years. Some of it was civil, some of it was financial, and some of it was ugly enough that if the wrong person opened the wrong drawer, the whole thing could collapse. Daniel had been trying to protect the family name, or maybe he was trying to protect himself. I don't know. What I did know was this. The children were desperate for the estate because they thought they were inheriting wealth. But wealth and responsibility often arrive in the same envelope, and they had no idea what was inside theirs. I signed the first page, then the second, then the third. Victoria was practically vibrating with excitement. Evan asked, "That's it?" I handed the pen back to Mark. "That's it." Victoria laughed under her breath. "Wow, I thought you'd put up more of a fight." I looked at her and said, "For what?" She frowned. "For your place." I said, "I know my place." The room went quiet. Mark's expression changed in a way I cannot forget. He knew. He knew something had just happened. Something the children had not yet understood. He collected the papers, scanned them, and then paused at one page longer than the others. His face went still, very still. He looked up at Evan and Victoria, and for the first time I saw real concern in him. "Did you two review the successor acceptance clause?" he asked. Evan scoffed. "Of course we reviewed it." Mark tapped the page with his finger. "Then you understand that by accepting the estate as beneficiaries and transferees, you are also accepting all linked obligations held by the deceased through the Harrington entities." Victoria laughed lightly. "That's standard." Mark did not laugh back. "No," he said. "Not this version." The room fell silent. He turned another page, then another. I just watched, because what they were hearing now was the first real sound of their father's hidden life crashing into theirs. Mark stood up and asked for a moment with the documents. He stepped into the hall and made 2 phone calls. The first was to a forensic accountant. The second was to a bankruptcy attorney. I could hear only pieces of the conversation, but it was enough. Unsecured exposures. Potential successor responsibility. No, I don't think they understand. Hidden corporate liabilities. Yes, probably significant. When he came back into the room, the children were no longer looking victorious. They were looking confused, then angry, then afraid. Evan leaned forward. "Explain it again." Slowly, Mark sat down and folded his hands. "Your father's empire was structured in a way that separated public assets from private exposures. On paper, it looks strong, but the liabilities attached to certain entities were never fully resolved. Some obligations were deferred, some claims were suppressed. Some potential legal matters were never cleared." Victoria's voice sharpened. "That has nothing to do with us." Mark looked at her. "You signed acceptance." Evan frowned. "Acceptance of assets. Of the estate in full," Mark corrected. "And the documents you insisted on moving forward with also treat you as successor owners in the relevant business structures. That means the liabilities transfer with the interests." Victoria turned to me so fast I almost pitied her. "You knew." I met her eyes and said, "I knew enough." She stared at me with pure hatred. "You set us up." I shook my head once. "No, your father did." That was the truth. And truth, when spoken calmly, can sound colder than cruelty. Evan was standing now. His face had gone pale under all that expensive confidence. "You're lying," he said to Mark. Mark slid a set of additional files across the table. "I wish I were." He opened the first folder. There were tax notices, then another folder. Vendor disputes, then another. Internal compliance issues, then another. An email trail, then another. A sealed civil claim, and then the one that changed the room entirely. A government inquiry notice. Victoria's hand shook as she reached for it. She read a few lines, and her mouth opened slightly, like she could not breathe right. Evan snatched it from her. He read fast. Too fast. Then slower. Then he looked at Mark, and I swear I watched his entire body understand what his mind had not wanted to accept. Their father had not just hidden money problems, he had hidden legal danger. And now that danger had been tied to the very inheritance they were celebrating. Victoria whispered, "No, no, no, no." Evan turned on Mark. "Why wasn't this disclosed?" Mark's expression hardened. "Because your father controlled the records, the trusts, and the entity structure. He made choices. He also left instructions. He wanted the estate resolved through the transfer protocol you demanded today." Victoria gasped. "You're saying he knew?" Mark looked at the papers, then at me, then back at them. "I'm saying he knew enough to protect his wife." The room went absolutely silent. That was the part that hit them hardest. Not the debt, not the lawsuits, not the looming financial collapse. The fact that Daniel had protected me, and they had not even seen it. Evan's voice cracked a little. Protected her from what? Mark answered carefully. From exposure. Victoria looked at me like I had personally set fire to her life. "What are you, Claire? What did you know?" I finally stood up. When I stood, I felt every eye in the room on me. I was not the richest person there. I was not the loudest. I was not the most educated. But in that moment, I was the only one who was fully calm. "I knew my husband had secrets," I said. "I knew he carried things he never told me. I knew that people around him were afraid of what might come out one day." Evan snapped. "Then why didn't you warn us?" I looked at him and said, "You never asked me a single real question in 9 years." That hit him harder than any legal document. Victoria tried again, her voice shaking now. "So what now?" Mark answered. "Now we freeze the transfer pending a full forensic review. And if these liabilities are as extensive as they appear, you will need separate counsel immediately." Evan looked like he might collapse. Victoria's face had gone flat in shock. "And me?" I sat back down. I folded my hands. I waited. Because I had already made my choice the moment I signed those papers. I was out. I was no longer standing between the family and the inheritance. I was no longer the shield. I was no longer the target. I was no longer the woman they could blame for the consequences of a man they never truly understood. That same afternoon, their lawyers began calling. Then the accountants. Then the bank. Then the compliance team. Then the outside counsel. By evening, the word bankrupt had started appearing in conversations no one wanted to have. By the end of the week, they were learning things about their father that they had somehow managed to ignore for years. There were problems with the holdings. There were claims against the companies. There were guarantees nobody had mentioned. There were liabilities buried inside structures so carefully layered that even experienced lawyers needed time to unravel them. And through it all, I said very little. People kept asking me whether I felt guilty. My answer was simple. No, I did not build the lies. I did not hide the debts. I did not forge the papers. I did not threaten witnesses. I did not treat a loving woman like an outsider and then expect her to save me. I was married to a man who lived in shadows. But I was not one of the shadows. When the children tried to come after me again, it was too late. Their lawsuit against me collapsed because their own case depended on proving I had manipulated the estate. But every document they filed, every claim they made, every strategy they used only forced more attention onto the structure they had inherited. And the more attention they got, the worse it became for them. Their lawyers warned them that accepting the assets had also triggered obligations they could not easily walk away from without consequence. In plain language, they had grabbed for the money before understanding the cost. And now they were paying it. A month later, I moved out of the house. Not because anyone forced me. Because I wanted peace. I took only my personal items. A few dresses. My grandmother's ring. The framed photo of Daniel and me from a small trip we once took by the lake. Before everything became so heavy. That was all I wanted. Not the mansion. Not the name. Not the poisoned fortune. Just my life back, on my last morning there. I stood in the empty foyer, and looked around. I remembered every dinner, every argument, every quiet morning light through those windows. I remembered how alone I had sometimes felt in that beautiful house. And I realized something important. Power does not always look like shouting. Sometimes it looks like silence. Sometimes it looks like a woman signing her name with steady hands while the people who mocked her celebrate too early. Sometimes power is not taking everything. Sometimes power is walking away before the fire reaches you. Evan never called me again. Victoria di Donce. Her voice was small when she spoke. She asked, "Did you ever love him?" I was quiet for a long time. Then I said, "Yes, enough to grieve him, not enough to become him." And I hung up. That is the part people never understand. This was never a story about a poor woman marrying rich. It was a story about arrogance, about entitlement, about people who thought their father's money gave them the right to humiliate a widow, about children who saw grief as weakness, about a woman they underestimated because she did not dress like a queen or speak like one of them. They mistook calm for fear. They mistook silence for ignorance. They mistook my dignity for surrender. And in the end, those mistakes cost them everything. So if you are listening to me right now, and you have ever been treated like you were nothing, I want you to remember this. Sometimes the strongest move is not to fight loudly. Sometimes the strongest move is to stay still, to listen, to read the fine print, to let the people who look down on you reveal their own foolishness. And then, when the moment comes, to walk away clean. That is what I did. They called me a gold digger. They sued me. They laughed when I signed away the estate. And then they inherited the debt, the lies, and the disaster their father had buried for years. Me? I left with my name intact. And in the end, that was worth more than everything they thought they had won.